Okay, now back to this breaking news. A Senate inquiry's scathing final report into the Australian Securities and Investments Commission has recommended the watchdog be split up. The 20-month-long inquiry by the Senate Economics Committee says ASIC routinely fails to prosecute corporate crime because its remit is too wide. Now, this report has only just come out, so I'll just go through a few of the recommendations with you before we get to Jeff Morris. He's been a key figure in this over the last 16 years now. He blew the whistle on the Commonwealth Bank doing the wrong thing by consumers and fought to get an inquiry up and finally got the Royal Commission. And he's been really frustrated with ASIC over the years because he went to ASIC to raise the alarm and was met with a bit of a brick wall. So it'll be really interesting to hear what he's got to say. But just going through a few of these recommendations first. So recommendation 1, the Australian Government recognise that ASIC has comprehensively failed to fulfil its regulatory remit. That's a pretty big blow to start with. It also says the failures call into question whether its remit is too broad for it to be an effective and efficient agency, and the government should strongly consider separating its functions between a company's regulator and a separate financial conduct authority. There are 11 recommendations. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'll just go to a couple of the others. The committee recommends the Australian Government make it a legislated regulatory objective of the Commission or other regulatory authorities to establish and maintain a high level of transparency of investigation and enforcement outcomes. It also goes to whistleblower provisions, talking about compensation. It'd be interesting to hear from Jeff on them. And the committee recommends the regulatory authorities adopt an enforcement approach which prioritises the litigation of all serious instances of suspected breaches of corporations law, particularly in cases where consumer losses arise or could have potentially arisen from such breaches. So that's just going through 3 or 4 of these recommendations of this inquiry that's just come out. Jeff Morris, who I mentioned, is a whistleblower on the banking industry who triggered an ASIC Senate inquiry back in 2013 and also eventually the Royal Commission as well, and he joins us now. Jeff Morris, welcome.
Thanks,
so
Joe.
You've kind of been here before, and so how does it feel after hearing some of these recommendations from this Senate inquiry?
Well, it's déjà vu, really. I mean, the Senate inquiry in 2013-14, which came out of the revelations about the Commonwealth Bank, and part of those revelations were that ASIC basically was a corporate lapdog, and CBA just tickled their tummy and they rolled over. So in many ways, I blew the whistle more on ASIC than anything else. And in fact, you can trace all the misbehaviour in the financial services sector, not just Commonwealth Bank, the other banks as well. It all came back to the fact that there was a regulator who was missing in action. And that inquiry reported almost exactly 10 years ago in 2014. And in a 547-page report, was absolutely scathing of ASIC. They made the comment that they were recommending a Royal Commission, which they didn't do lightly, because they couldn't trust ASIC to do their job properly in relation to the Commonwealth Bank. We've had condemnation of ASIC in every inquiry that's been undertaken over the years, and indeed in the Royal Commission as well, where the Commissioner was highly critical of ASIC and the fact that they were so timid. They never took on the big end of town in litigation. Little financial planner operating out of the corner store, they might muster the courage to beat him up occasionally and score a cheap headline. But I mean, I've said, based on my experience from 2008, I've said before, getting ASIC to do their job was literally like flogging a dead horse. They were just inert.
And so you've heard these scathing words about ASIC before. Hearing a couple of these recommendations, does this give you any heart that things are going to change adequately?
Look, I think eventually the cacophony of noise surrounding ASIC's failures, eventually, surely it can't be ignored any longer. But as I say, we've had a number of these reports, and they're all damning of ASIC. And I think the comment here is very fair when it says comprehensively failed to fulfil its regulatory remit. Well, that says it all. This is an organisation. In the past, I have actually concluded that ASIC, the existence of ASIC, I think, is a negative. And so I think it's not just useless, which is what this committee is basically saying. It's worse than useless, because the existence of ASIC, with, among other things, a mandate for consumer protection, misleads people into thinking that it's not a jungle out there. We'd be better off without a corporate regulator than a joke regulator, because at least people would be on their guard.
Yeah, so this recommendation 2, after saying it's a comprehensive failure, is that it should be split up. How do you feel about that? Or, as you just said, do you think it needs to be abolished altogether?
Look, my view's always been that the culture at ASIC is so sick, and I saw this up close as they just failed to do their job. The culture there is so sick. There's a culture of inertia, and they're so complacent and self-satisfied, and they do nothing. They do absolutely nothing. And again, this committee's picked up on that. Yet again, another committee's picked up on the fact that they don't actually deal with misconduct reports. Most misconduct reports that go to ASIC just get filed and then ignored. They don't act on them. And again, as this committee's found, as previous committees have found, when they do act, their enforcement action is literally like hitting somebody with a wet lettuce leaf. It's that pathetic. So, yeah, I mean, ASIC is, I think, irredeemable. And the best solution is to start again, because if you don't do that, you're afflicted with the same culture that this organisation has. And there's a good recent example of that. There's a body that supports, that reports to ASIC, was called the Financial Ombudsman Service. And so they renamed it AFCA, and they expected things to change. All the people who were employed at FOSS, which was a complete failure as a consumer protection body, went across to AFCA, and guess what? AFCA has been a complete failure as well. So unless you have wholesale personnel changes, ASIC will just continue to fail.
Yeah, so even this splitting up recommendation you think is a bit pointless. You've got to start from the ground up.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would be part of it, because I think the corporate regulation and filing company returns, for which, by the way, ASIC charges outrageous fees, and they rake off this profit, which I think disguises a lot of the inefficiency in the rest of the organisation. Absolutely, it should be split up. But then I think you've got to demolish the whole structure and build on a sound foundation.
Yeah. And what about the recommendation about focusing on getting prosecutions?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. ASIC has run a mile from prosecuting people, but the reason for that is they're so incompetent. And I recently observed a case where ASIC had an absolute slam dunk of a prosecution, and they completely bungled it, and they lost the case. And then the witness who'd put themselves on the line to help ASIC do their job threw them to the wolves as well. I mean, they're a terrible organisation. They have no shame.
Okay,
in what they do.
So now after this, another inquiry, the government has an opportunity to address this significantly. What's at stake here if something is not done?
Well, the same thing will keep happening. There's been, over the last couple of decades, there's been massive fraud on consumers. So there were agribusiness investment schemes that were they were a joke. And if we'd had a decent corporate regulator who'd, if they needed more powers to do their job, had insisted on being given those powers, none of those products should have gone to market. The financial planning industry was running completely out of control, and it was just a sales channel for ripping off widows and orphans. Again, all on ASIC's watch. So unless at some point somebody takes these criticisms seriously and says, we're going to take ASIC apart brick by brick and rebuild it, those problems will just recur. Maybe 4 or 5 years' time from now, maybe even sooner, but the same cycle will just repeat, because the problem at the end of the day, it's an overall problem. As Napoleon said, a major disaster implies a major culprit. And the culprit in terms of the disaster that's been our financial services sector is ASIC, the regulator.
What about this recommendation in regards to whistleblowers? Because as you've been enveloped by this over the last 16 years, you've worked very hard on the whistleblower front. One recommendation here, amending whistleblower protection provisions in the Corporations Act to include pecuniary incentives and compensation for whistleblowers who make a substantiated disclosure.
Yeah. Well, what myself and others disclosed about the banks resulted in $10 billion in compensation being paid to consumers. It wasn't small potatoes. There were whistleblowers who were put in hospital through the strain they were put in. Many of us were diagnosed with PTSD. We all lost our careers, and so there's easy justification for financial compensation, because when you blow the whistle, your career's over. You'll never work in that industry again. People cheer whistleblowers, but they don't employ them. So you really, if you're going into it with your eyes open, you're making a decision to sacrifice your career for the good of others. And I don't think it's at all unreasonable that people should be compensated by that. But hey, in theory, we're already there, because this Labor government in 2019 promised compensation for banking whistleblowers. I've yet to see any of that. They've been in power for 2 years. So this isn't a big leap. This is something that the Labor Party committed to 5 years ago. And yet they're still consulting about it. It's a constant talk fest and no action ever comes of it. But I seriously wonder, I think this government is all over the place on whistleblowers. I mean, this is absolutely what should happen if you want to stamp out corruption, is reward whistleblowers so more come forward. But this government, despite talking a big game on whistleblower protection, about 6 weeks ago it put a whistleblower in prison. So amongst the whistleblower community, the Albanese government has less credibility than any other in living memory after what they've done. And nobody could trust them. So even if there were rewards, that wouldn't fix it.
And Jeff Morris, after having been through everything you've been through after blowing the whistle 16 years ago, and the challenges you faced since then, would you do the same thing again now?
I would, and you know, I kind of saw fairly early on that this is where it was going to go, that ASIC was the problem, and ultimately to fix the problem that was the financial services industry in this country, ASIC had to be fixed. So this report has just, I guess, helped to throw that into even more stark clarity. And I think every time there's another report that comes out that slams ASIC and reveals the fact they basically don't do their job, I think we move a bit closer to some worthwhile reform. So I'm glad to see it.
Yeah. Okay, Jeff Morris, thanks so much for coming in and having a chat to us.
Thank you, Joe. Pleasure.